I walked up to my own front door to find the locks changed, the bank account drained, and a stranger wearing my clothes standing in my living room. Then, things got truly terrifying. The rain didn't just fall. It felt like it was trying to erase me from the pavement. I stood on the landing of our fifth-floor apartment, staring at the matte black finish of the door I had picked out myself, feeling the sting of the cold dampening my hair. I pressed my palm against the wood, half expecting the smart lock to chime and acknowledge my fingerprint, but the LED remained stubbornly dead. "Mark, open the door," I said, my voice barely audible over the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the hallway window. "This isn't funny. I have my groceries in the car, I'm freezing, and we have that dinner reservation in 40 minutes. Silence. It wasn't the silence of someone sleeping or someone playing a prank. It was the heavy, intentional silence of someone holding their breath. I heard the muffled clink of a glass, the sound of ice settling against crystal. He was in there. He was sitting on our velvet sofa, probably sipping the expensive scotch I'd bought him for our anniversary, listening to me beg to enter my own home. I reached into my purse, my fingers trembling as they fumbled for my emergency key. I pulled it out, the silver glinting under the harsh fluorescent flicker of the hallway light, and jammed it into the keyhole. It wouldn't turn. It didn't just resist. It felt like the cylinder had been changed from the inside. They had swapped the locks while I was at the office. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled out my phone, the screen slick with rain, and dialed his number. It rang once, twice, and then went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I opened the banking app. My hands shook so violently, I mistyped my password twice. When I finally got in, the screen blurred. The joint account, the one where the mortgage payments were pulled from, was empty. Not just low balance empty, it was completely drained, and the account itself had been closed. I leaned my forehead against the door, closing my eyes. "Mark, you don't understand what you're doing," I whispered into the wood. "That deed is in my name. The taxes, the insurance, the purchase price, it all came from my inheritance. You have absolutely no legal right to keep me out." Suddenly, the door clicked. Not the sound of the lock disengaging, but the sharp, mechanical noise of the security chain being slid across the track from the inside. A sliver of light appeared as the door cracked open 3 inches. I caught a glimpse of his eye, cold, detached, and utterly unrecognizable. "You're mistaken, Clara," he said, his voice a low, smooth monotone that chilled me more than the rain. "You don't own this place anymore. You don't own anything." He went to slam the door, but I lunged, wedging my shoulder into the gap to stop it from closing. He didn't pull back. He just leaned his weight against the door, crushing my shoulder between the frame and the heavy slab of oak. I gasped, the pain sharp and blinding, but I didn't let go. I looked through the gap, my vision tunneling, and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the background of our living room, right by the fireplace, was a woman. She was wearing my silk robe, the one I thought I'd lost months ago, and she was holding a stack of legal documents, the kind that looked suspiciously like the property title I kept in the floor safe. She smiled at me, a soft, predatory thing, and tapped a manicured finger against the glass of wine in her hand. "Mark," I wheezed, my shoulder screaming in protest, "who is that?" He leaned closer, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of the scotch I had paid for. "That," he whispered, "is the person who actually owns this apartment now, and she wants you gone before the police arrive." I pushed back, using every ounce of adrenaline to force the door an inch wider, but Mark was immovable, his body a barricade of granite. The woman in my robe didn't flinch. She set her glass down on the marble mantel and walked toward the door with a slow, hypnotic grace that made my skin crawl. She wasn't just a stranger. She moved like she owned the air in the room, like she had been rehearsing this moment for months. The police? I gasped, my shoulder throbbing in a rhythmic, sickening cadence. What are you talking about, Mark? You've been drinking. You're having some kind of episode. The police are on their way to escort you off the property for harassment, Clara, she said, her voice like velvet dragged over gravel. She stopped beside Mark, placing a hand on his forearm. He didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch, his eyes never leaving mine. It was a look of absolute, chilling betrayal. You really shouldn't have shown up here tonight. We were having such a peaceful evening until you started banging on the door like a common intruder. This is my house, I screamed, the sound echoing down the sterile hallway. Check the county records. I am the sole owner. Mark laughed, a short, jagged sound that had no humor in it. You're the owner of a paper trail, Clara. But a paper trail is only as good as the person holding the pen. And you've been so busy with your career, so distracted by your inheritance, that you didn't notice the paper trail was being rewritten. He shifted his weight, his knee driving into my stomach. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful hiss, and my grip on the edge of the door slipped. I stumbled backward, landing hard on the cold hallway tile. Before I could scramble back up, Mark reached out and grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging into my skin like iron bands. He didn't pull me in, he dragged me closer, forcing me to look at the documents the woman was holding. They weren't just random papers. They were notarized affidavits, signatures that looked disturbingly like my own, and a quitclaim deed that had been filed and recorded 3 days ago. My stomach dropped. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't been anywhere near a notary. Forgery, I choked out, my voice trembling. That's a felony. Both of you. You're going to prison. The woman knelt in the doorway, her face inches from mine, her eyes bright with a manic, terrifying glee. Forgery is such a harsh word, darling. Let's call it a transfer of equity, a settlement for all the years you spent neglecting your husband, for all the times you chose your bank account over his needs. You thought money kept you safe? Money is just a tool, and you just handed it over. She reached out and snatched my phone from my hand, the one I'd been using to try and record the conversation. She didn't drop it. She simply tossed it into the apartment and slammed the door. The sound of the lock clicking, a heavy multi-bolt engagement, rang out like a gunshot in the hallway. I scrambled to my feet, frantic, pounding on the wood. Open the door! I'm calling the police! From inside, I heard the faint, muffled sound of a phone dialing. Mark's voice rose, calm and deliberate, perfectly rehearsed. Yes, hello? I'd like to report a trespasser. She's my ex-wife, she's clearly unstable, and she's currently screaming at my door and threatening me. Yes, I have a protection order pending. Please, hurry. She's becoming violent. I froze, my hands hovering over the wood. My blood turned to ice. He hadn't just changed the locks. He had been building a case against me while I slept in the same bed as him. I heard the elevator at the end of the hall ding, the service lift, the one that led directly to the lobby. Footsteps began to echo, heavy and rhythmic, moving toward the landing. I turned, heart racing, and looked toward the stairwell door. But as I moved to run, the hallway lights flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness. Then, the sound of the stairwell door groaned open, and a beam of light cut through the gloom, pinning me against the locked door of my own home like a moth on a board. Ma'am, a gravelly voice demanded, step away from the door. Now. I raised my hands, my breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps, as the shadow of a uniformed officer stretched long and ominous across the floor. But then, I heard a sound from inside the apartment, a soft, wet thud, followed by the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy blade sliding out of a sheath. The officer's flashlight beam danced across my face, blindingly bright, pinning me to the wood. My heart was a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, but my ears were focused solely on the silence behind the door, or rather, the sudden, terrifying absence of it. The wet thud I'd heard was followed by a low, stifled gasp, a sound so human and so pained that it couldn't have come from a television or a radio. "I said step away from the door, ma'am," the officer repeated, his hand drifting to the side of his belt where his holster rested. "We received a call about a domestic disturbance." Hands where I can see them. "You don't understand," I hissed, my voice cracking. I didn't move. I couldn't move. If I stepped away, I was abandoning the only evidence I had that something was horribly wrong in there. "Someone is being hurt inside. Please, you have to break down that door. That's my apartment. My ex-husband is in there, and he's not alone." The officer stepped closer, his boots heavy and rhythmic. He was older, his face etched with lines of exhaustion and cynicism. He took one look at me, my disheveled hair, my tear-streaked face, my trembling hands, and his expression hardened into one of pitying dismissal. "Ma'am, I've heard this story a dozen times tonight. The tenant inside has already briefed dispatch. He's got documentation of a hostile separation. Now step back or I'm going to have to detain you." "Listen!" I shrieked, ignoring his command. I pressed my ear against the door, desperate for any sound that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, a voice drifted through the wood. Not Mark's voice, and not the woman's. It was a strained, gargled murmur, sounding as if the person's mouth were covered by a heavy cloth. It was a plea for help, muffled and frantic. My skin crawled. The woman inside hadn't been standing there with a drink. She had been standing there with a victim. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, grabbing the officer's sleeve. He shoved me back, his eyes narrowing. "That's it. You're coming with me." As he reached for his handcuffs, the deadbolt on my apartment door clicked. My breath hitched. The door didn't swing open. It was pulled inward just an inch, then pushed wide. Mark stood there. He wasn't the man who had been screaming at me moments ago. He was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his shirt stained with a dark, wet smear that looked black in the dim light of the hallway. He collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling as he held them up. "Officer, thank God," he rasped, his voice breaking with a performance so perfect it made me feel physically ill. She wouldn't stop. She attacked me, and then she went after the woman I'm with." The officer's eyes widened. He pushed past me, his flashlight cutting through the apartment's entrance, illuminating a scene that made my stomach turn over. The living room was in shambles. The velvet sofa was overturned, and the expensive rug was bunched up, stained with that same dark, metallic-smelling fluid. And there, slumped against the marble fireplace, was the woman who had smirked at me through the gap moments before. Her head was lolled to the side, her eyes fixed and sightless, the silk robe I recognized so clearly now soaked in crimson. "Clara," Mark sobbed, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "She broke in. She had a knife. She told me if she couldn't have the apartment, no one could." The officer turned toward me, his hand now gripped firmly around his weapon. The mercy in his eyes had vanished, replaced by the cold, tactical alertness of a man facing a killer. "Ma'am," he growled, drawing his sidearm. "Hands behind your head, now." "No," I stammered, backing away toward the stairwell, my pulse roaring in my ears. "No, he killed her. He's framing me." "I saw her reach for something in her purse," Mark shouted from the floor, his voice rising into a wail of manufactured terror. "Officer, watch out! She's still got the blade!" The officer took a step toward me, his gun leveled at my chest. I looked at Mark, who was watching me with a gaze so devoid of humanity, so cold and calculated, that I realized the final piece of his plan. He hadn't just stolen my home and my assets. He had been waiting for the perfect moment to erase me entirely. I turned and bolted for the stairwell, my heart exploding in my chest, but as I hit the heavy metal door, I heard the sharp, terrifying metallic click of the handle, and realized, with a jolt of pure, unadulterated horror, that the door had been bolted from the outside. I was trapped in the stairwell with no exit, the officer's footsteps pounding toward me, and from the dark, echoing shadows beneath me, I heard the distinct sound of a door opening and the click of a hammer being pulled back on a gun. The stairwell was a concrete throat, cold and suffocating. The footsteps above me were heavy, purposeful, and getting closer with every passing second. I scrambled up the steps, my fingers clawing at the metal door that had been chained from the outside, but it wouldn't budge. I was a rat in a cage, and the walls were closing in. Click. The sound came from the landing below. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. I pressed my back against the cold metal door and looked down into the abyss of the stairwell, where the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "Clara," a voice hissed. It wasn't the officer. It wasn't Mark. It was a woman's voice, hollow, strained, and vibrating with an intensity that made my teeth ache. I squinted into the gloom. A figure emerged from the stairwell door on the 4th floor, illuminated by the dim, flickering emergency lights. It was the woman from the apartment. The woman I had seen slumped over by the fireplace, lifeless and bloodied, was currently standing 3 steps below me, wiping a smear of red off her cheek with a tissue. She wasn't dead. She wasn't even injured. The crimson on her robe was a crude prop, a theatrical smear designed to condemn me. "You really are as predictable as he said you'd be," she sneered, her eyes scanning the stairwell. She wasn't holding a knife anymore. She was holding a suppressed pistol, the long barrel looking like an extension of her own pale finger. "Mark said you'd run for the stairs. He said you'd try to act the victim, even when the evidence was practically handed to you on a silver platter." "Why?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I slid my hand into my pocket. My fingers closed around the one thing I hadn't expected to have, the digital voice recorder I'd been using for my work meetings. I'd slipped it into my pocket earlier that day, entirely by accident. It had been running since I arrived at the apartment door. "Why?" She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. "Because you were an obstacle, Clara. An obstacle with an inheritance, a perfect credit score, and a husband who grew bored of playing house. He didn't just want the apartment. He wanted the life you built, and he wanted to be rid of the person who made it possible." The heavy footsteps of the officer reached the landing above. "I have you cornered, Clara," he bellowed, his voice booming down the shaft. "Drop the weapon." The woman didn't flinch. She aimed the pistol directly at my heart. "Give me the recording," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Mark told me you always keep a recorder on you. Hand it over. Maybe we'll make it look like a tragic accident, a slip, a fall down the stairs. It's been a long day for everyone, hasn't it?" I looked at her, then up toward the approaching light of the officer. I realized then that they were working in tandem, the police, the legal system, the witness. They had built a wall of lies so tall that truth had no room to breathe. But they hadn't accounted for the fact that I wasn't just a victim. I was a strategist. I didn't hand over the recorder. Instead, I pulled it out and slammed the broadcast button, a feature I'd installed for remote syncing to the cloud, linked directly to my lawyer's private server and the local news desk's tip line. The device chirped, a bright digital sound that cut through the tension like a blade. "Recording uploaded," the device announced in its flat, synthetic tone. The woman's expression shifted from smugness to pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged, but I dropped to my knees, sliding beneath her swing. As she stumbled, her own momentum carried her toward the railing. She grabbed at me, but I shoved her away, and in her desperation, her pistol clattered across the concrete and slipped through the gap in the railings, falling down the center of the stairwell. At that exact moment, the stairwell door above burst open. The officer rushed in, gun drawn, but he stopped dead. He saw me on the floor, the woman scrambling to regain her footing, and the recorder lying between us. "Officer!" I shouted, holding up my phone, which was now streaming the live audio to the cloud server, showing a time-stamped transcript on the screen. "I have everything. The forged deeds, the conversation about the transfer of equity, and her confession. It's all going to the DA right now." The officer looked at the woman, then at me, then at the heavy, dark silence of the stairwell. He saw the recording device. He saw the woman, whose hands were covered in the stage blood she'd used to frame me. He realized, in that split second, that the script had flipped. If he pulled the trigger now, he wouldn't be stopping a criminal. He'd be committing murder on a live feed. He lowered his weapon, his face turning an ashen gray. "What is this?" "This," I said, standing up and brushing the dust off my coat, my voice cold and steady for the first time that night, "is the end of your tenure and the beginning of your prison sentence." Mark appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at the scene, his face draining of color. He saw the officer's lowered gun. He saw the woman's realization. And he saw me, standing in the center of the trap he'd set, holding the keys to his destruction. I didn't need the apartment anymore. I didn't need the life I'd built with him. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second, I walked past him toward the lobby. I didn't look back. I knew the weight of the handcuffs that were about to click onto his wrists would be the only thing he'd carry for the rest of his life. I finally owned my future, and for the first time in years, the silence that followed wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was freedom.